Hello, friends, seekers of wisdom in the landscapes of many ideas. I am so excited to present to you this presentation on the nature of consciousness and what it is, even how to think about consciousness. My goal in this presentation is to see if we can get some clarity. This is a topic I have been obsessing over in the last several years as I've been working on a book on this, and even just before the book. This is something that I've been thinking a lot about. When I was in graduate school, I took many different courses in the field of the philosophy of mind from many different professors and viewpoints. Took a course from Jaegwon Kim. Some of you may know he's one of the leading philosophers of mind. He wrote the book Physicalism or Something Near Enough, and that was a treat to take his class. I took courses with Alvin Plantinga, Michael Tooley, Robert Hanna, other philosophers of mind, and since then began contributing into the field myself. But what I've noticed is that there's a lot of confusion, clouds of confusion. And I think a lot of these points of confusion come from just not making some distinctions that can really help to clarify the landscape of possibilities. And so that's what I want to do with you today, is to see if I can help clarify the landscape of possibilities so that we can get a little bit greater clarity. The other week, I was taking a walk around the block, as I often do, to kind of think. And also I was holding my baby. He's 9 months old now. And so I'm holding the baby, multitasking, taking care of the baby and thinking, which is great. And I was thinking specifically about this topic and how there can be clouds of controversy that sort of roll in and create confusion that blocks the sight of developments, treasures in the fields that people have been bringing into the light. And so what I want to do is to see if I can help bring to light some of these treasures, not by making a case for a particular position today, but rather by showing a landscape of positions available today. A lot of people are not aware of the landscape of positions available, and so I want to give a kind of a survey of all the different views, as well as I'm going to offer my own kind of latest thinking about how to clarify those views by presenting a new classification scheme. I'm going to present that near the end. So let's see if we can make some headway here. My purpose, as I've already kind of mentioned, is to clarify what is at stake in developing our understanding of consciousness. I want to see if we can get some clarity. Sometimes I'll go onto social media and I'll get a sense of what people are thinking out there in social media land. And I've noticed a kind of gap between popular conversations and conversations I'm seeing behind the scenes, not just by philosophers of mind, but also neuroscientists and other scientists who are thinking about consciousness, the science of consciousness. And I've been looking at how we can approach this in a way that can give us a bigger picture where we bring more voices to the table. And I think to do that, it's going to help to get a clarity about how to classify the different theories of consciousness. So that's my big purpose, and some of the outcomes here for you guys is I'm going to share with you 3 fundamental questions that I see a theory of consciousness seeking to answer. And distinguishing these questions, I think, is going to really help to clarify the terrain. I myself had kind of confused some of these questions and lumped them into one question. And so I wasn't seeing how different answers to different questions were importantly different. And by making these distinctions, I think that by itself is going to give us some more power to see what is at stake. I'm also going to give an overview of the major theories, the sort of classic classification. And I'm going to describe what I see as a kind of flagship challenge or problem that each theory faces. I want to just point to one. There are many, of course, but I want to show what I think is the problem that I see the people in the fields talking about, and also that would change people's minds moving from position to position. So I'm going to talk about that, what I see as the big problem in each of the views. And again, my goal here is not to argue for one view over another, although toward the end I'm going to kind of give you some of my cards on the table, kind of let you know where I'm at currently, as well as offer some ideas about the future of consciousness and where this is headed. So this is related to a new classification that I'm going to offer at the end that I think can fit very well with the classic classification, but help us to get to some root concepts that can really inform our understanding of the different theories of the mind. So what's really at stake here? Well, part of what's at stake here that I see is that there's a great problem in that there's a lot of confusion about how to even think about the nature of our minds, what we are, how we think, how we feel, where we came from. These are all big questions that are anchored into the general question of consciousness. What is it? Why does it exist? And what I see are some interesting developments by theorists working out clear lines of analysis, making new observations of interesting correlations between mental states and various effects and various causes of mental states. And so putting these observations together with these lines of analysis has been leading to what I would consider to be a kind of revolution in our understanding. There's an increased wisdom, I think, in the landscape of ideas. But there are clouds of confusion that roll in and leave people feeling maybe a bit powerless to see things for themselves, or maybe even a bit confident that certain people who offer their piece are offering the only analysis. And I think sometimes this happens because of, I'm going to talk about next, some of the things that result in these clouds of confusion, this sort of lack of clarity. So very quickly, 3 sources of confusion that I see. First, there's a lot of data. There's a lot of data relevant to consciousness, to awareness, to contents of consciousness. Even with respect to how to define these terms and how to think about these things in relation to various fields in science. There's data in neuroscience that's relevant to this. There's data in neurobiology that's relevant to this. Data in physics that's relevant to this. There's data in an obscure field that I get very excited about that's not very well known, but it's a field called mereology. M-E. How do you spell mereology? M-E-O-R-ology. Okay, now you guys, I've got to make sure I'm not giving you false information, misinformation. Mereology, M-E-R-E-O-L. I'm looking it up. Mereological. I can't even pronounce, can't even spell. It's possible I might cut this out, or I might leave this in, so you can see where I have my weaknesses. I'm not very good at spelling sometimes. So thank goodness for tools and other people who help me. Okay, mereology. Mereology, M-E-R-E-O-L-O-G-Y. This is a field of study in theories of parts and wholes. How do parts connect to wholes? What are parts? What does it take for a bunch of parts to be unified into a single whole? Right? Like if you are a whole being, what are your parts and what does it take to unify your parts into a whole being? This is not trivial. Years ago, I wrote a computer program for a grant that had to do with investigating how life forms could evolve through natural selection. And my computer program was on a theoretical level, trying to investigate in general terms what kinds of results would happen given certain inputs, and the creatures in my simulation are competing for survival. But one of the questions that came up very early in my programming was this question about parts and wholes. I had parts of things that I called bugs. These were creatures. But which parts belong to which creatures? And it wasn't like I could just analyze the parts, and by knowing the positions of the parts and the relationships between the parts, that I could deduce which parts belong to which creatures. I needed another principle that connects parts to wholes, even a theory of parts and wholes. So there are all these questions that are easy to kind of skip past because they're very, very foundational. And in order to think about consciousness, it helps to be aware of many of these very foundational considerations and very foundational questions. But what I see is that some theorists will be working in a field, let's say mereology, parts and wholes, and they'll get an analysis that's relevant to theories of consciousness. But then other theorists will be working, let's say in neuroscience, they'll be getting data relevant to theories of consciousness, but they won't necessarily see each other's data. They won't necessarily have each other's information. So how can we bring more data together? This is where theories, I think, are going to help us to see what the range of options are. Another source of confusion is that there's lots of different ways to explain the same data. Sometimes what I see that happens is there's a model that gets kind of read into the data. A hint of this is if somebody says, hey, we know P, and then they cite data D in support of P. We know P, and they cite data D in support of P. But other theorists are saying on the basis of that same data D, we know, or at least a case can be made for not P. What's going on there? Well, part of what's going on there is that there's many different models that can explain the same data. And this leads to confusion if we're not even aware of what those different models are. That's part of what I want to do here is offer, just at the kind of big picture level, bird's eye view, what many of the major options are. And I think that's going to empower our search and our thinking. And also there are many different methodologies. This also leads to interesting opportunities, I think, for more people to come to the table, bring their methodologies together. But we have to see what these methodologies are. We have to appreciate their strengths as well as their limitations. And so what I want to do next is I want to talk about how we can get some clarity that can help us roll away some of those clouds of confusion. And there are many things that we could do to try to get some clarity. But in this video, I'm going to try to do one thing, which is just to classify different theories. By classifying different theories, I think that's by itself is going to light a flame of clarity. Classification will light the flame of clarity, and in three ways. It's going to clarify options, it's going to clarify concepts, and then by clarifying concepts and options, I think that's going to help us to have a kind of comparative sight of how this theory over here might have an edge or an advantage over this theory over here, because we're aware of this theory over here. We can actually compare that. Sometimes what I see is that there are models that can explain some data, but those models are out of view for some people. And because they're out of view, the people might recognize certain weaknesses in their own models, but they're not recognizing how there are other models that don't have those weaknesses. Maybe those other models have other kinds of weaknesses, but they don't have those same weaknesses. And so I think just being aware of the range of options all on its own is going to empower more people to come together in this great construction of more wisdom about consciousness. And I want this because, like many of you, I'm curious, and I continue to be curious. And even as I begin to turn over some rocks and I begin to see some things that look like treasures from where I'm at, I want more treasures. And I don't want fool's gold. And so if something looks like a treasure and it's not, I want to be able to see that. And the only way that I'm going to do that is if more people are coming together to bring more data, more options to the table, so we can get a bigger picture of reality. And I think this is already happening, and this is going to happen more. I see a lot of this behind the scenes. This is part of why I'm excited to share this with you, because I want to share some of the developments in the field that studies the nature of mind and consciousness. All right, so first thing, I want to just point out three fundamental questions to distinguish when thinking about the nature of consciousness and how it fits into the world. Three distinct questions. Often these are kind of conflated. Just distinguishing these, I think, all by itself is going to help us even to build out our own theory. You know, as we're considering our own observations and reading other people's works, we can kind of take together everything that we see, and we can see how does this fit with these questions. So here are the three questions that a theory of consciousness could seek to address. I'm not saying these are the only questions, but in my experience, these are fundamental questions that probably most other questions is going to be falling under one of these. It's going to be a specific version of one of these. So there's first, it's called the identity question. This is the question about what consciousness, I almost want to define consciousness here, you know, state of awareness, but part of the question here is how do we even define it? What do we even mean by the word consciousness? This is included in this identity question. What is it? What do we mean by it? Okay? What do we mean by it, and what is it? What's the nature of consciousness? And I want to include in consciousness anything that might be considered a content of consciousness. Some theorists would say that thoughts, feelings, emotions, intentions, visual images. These are contents of consciousness. What are these contents? Is the feeling of love a chemical reaction in a brain? Is that what it is? Or is it something else? What is it? What does it even mean to say what it is it? In my area, which includes ontology and existence, the nature of existence, one of the questions that we ask is this question about what is it to say what something is? And I think part of one answer that I find helpful is to list the aspects or attributes that it has. So what are the attributes of consciousness? What are the aspects of consciousness? That's a way of characterizing what it is. Another way of answering this question is to think about what it might be identical to. So I mentioned the feeling of love and chemical reactions. Is the feeling of love identical to a chemical reaction? Are they one and the same? Chemical reactions in a brain, feeling of love. Are they one and the same? Is there a way to test that? Is there a way to investigate that? So we'll be looking at some different answers to that. But here, just realizing that that is one of the fundamental questions, and that this question is different from this question, which I'm going to call the substance question. What has the consciousness? So think about this. Imagine you've got some particles in a brain, some atomic arrangements, let's say, that form neurons. Sometimes philosophers of mind talk about C fibers firing, okay? Axons behaving in a certain way. Let's say that those axons produce some kind of a consciousness in you. Do those axons also have the consciousness that they produce? Or is there something else that has the consciousness that's produced by these axons? See, this is a distinct question, because you could have distinct answers here. You could have the answer that which has the consciousness is the same as that which produces the consciousness, which is the same as that which maybe even is the consciousness. We could think about the correlation between these questions, but we can also separate them. Here's another question that will help us think about this. I call this the materials question, and this has to do with what makes consciousness, what generates it, what makes it. My view is that we need the right kind of reality, the right kind of material, in order for consciousness to emerge. And I hope that you can see the value of distinguishing these questions. For you might think that the material that makes consciousness is not the same as the material that has consciousness. Or you might think that they are the same, or you might think that they're related in certain ways. Let me just illustrate this a bit more. Imagine that you're reading a book, and this book has shapes in it, and these shapes allow you, a conscious being, to access certain states of consciousness. So say you're reading one of my books, okay, and you're just reading it line by line, and some of those lines are giving you a feeling of curiosity, and then some of the lines are giving you a feeling of, frustration, let's say. You start having these feelings. What's going on there? Well, the lines are representing information, and hopefully if you're interpreting those shapes, those lines on the page, in a certain way, you're getting access to information. You're getting access to some ideas in my mind. So the book is facilitating your access to certain states of consciousness that are represented there, right? So in some sense, we could say that the book is helping to make states of consciousness. The book is helping to produce within you some states of consciousness. Now, maybe it's not the book all on its own that's making those states. It's in cooperation with you. Maybe it's in cooperation with your brain in some way. But now we can ask, is the book that's helping to make consciousness, does that book also have consciousness? Is the book conscious? Does it have my thoughts literally in it? The book is thinking my thoughts. Well, I don't think that's how that works with books. I think probably you'll agree that at least in the case of books, we can make that distinction here. It makes a lot of sense to make that distinction between making the consciousness and then having it. And then also, what is the consciousness? Right? Because we could reduce the thoughts in my mind to the shapes on paper. We could have a reductive theory that says the thoughts in my mind just are those shapes. But I don't think that's right, because I think that I could have those thoughts without ever having written the book. The thoughts, in a sense, precede the book. Now, there's a similar set of questions about the relationship between conscious states and brain states. How do they go together? And theorists are divided on this. So some theorists think that brain states make and have conscious states. Some say that brain states are conscious states. Okay. Other theorists say that conscious states make brain states. Conscious states are actually able to generate and make brain states. And then some have two-way causal interaction. And so I'm going to get to some of these theories about how this might work in just a moment. But I think it's so helpful just to make a distinction between these three questions. In fact, honestly, if you got nothing else out of my presentation that I'm going to give with all these different theories, and all you took away was just distinguishing these three questions, I think that on its own is going to empower your own analysis as you're thinking through the different options and theories, as you're reading about this topic, if you're reading about it or talking about it or just thinking about it. I think just distinguishing these questions, like you can kind of think in your own mind, okay, here's some evidence that X and Y are connected, but now does that mean X makes Y? Does X have Y? Is X the same thing as Y? Those are importantly different questions. So as I continue, I'm going to come back to these questions as we look at some of the different answers, possible answers, different models of consciousness. And then you're going to see how these questions are very relevant to filling out our theory of consciousness. All right, so here is a classic classification. Now, let me just say, in preparing this PowerPoint, I had to kind of, what do I want to say, restrain myself, because there are just so many different theories and then subtheories and subtheories and subtheories. And it's tempting to try to just talk about all of it that I can. But I think that's not going to be so helpful to you. I think it's going to be more helpful to give you a big picture lay of the land, sort of a bird's eye view of a classic classification of the major options. And many of these I think are going to be familiar to many of you. And I'm going to talk about their flagship challenges. And then I'm going to give my own classification that I think can give an additional sort of clarity about what's at stake. So, as many of you know, one of the major views about the mind and about consciousness is called physicalism. That's one of the views. What is physicalism? Well, physicalism is basically the view that everything is fundamentally physical. Now, I try to capture this theory of physicalism, we'll talk about different versions of the theory, in a way that is simple, but then also can encompass a lot of options. The key word here, of course, is physical. What does it mean to be physical? Fundamental is also a key word. We can talk about this as we look through the different theories. I had this question early in graduate school. I was taking various courses on the philosophy of mind, and this word came up a lot. Is our mental states physical states? And so I remember asking one of my professors in his office hours, how do you define physical? And I was sort of just expecting some standard classic definition, but he said, Josh, this is a really difficult question, and it's a very good question. Little did I know just how much truth there is to what he was telling me. Later, I took a course with Alvin Planning on the philosophy of mind. We spent the first month just talking about how we might define physical. And a good source on this is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Physicalism. It's a very beautiful source that goes through different strategies for defining physical, different definitions. And part of the challenge in classifying theories just is that every word in every theory can be a challenge to define. But let me just say kind of two broad strategies here for thinking about the term physical. One is to think about it epistemologically in terms of just whatever it is that physicists are studying at base. That's going to count as physical. So whatever that turns out to be, we'll call that physical. That's kind of epistemological account because it has to do with finding out things based on a certain kind of instrument of investigation through empirical physics, through science. Another way of thinking about physical is to actually spell out a definition. One kind of definition sometimes people have given is in terms of spatial position or spatial qualities. So it's physical if it has spatial position or spatial qualities. Now, I'm not so sure myself if that is going to be the most helpful definition. In fact, I would say probably not, because many people who would call themselves physicalists today, they're not committed to this kind of spatial criterion. They're not saying that if it's physical, it has to be fundamentally spatial. And recent work in physics also is pointing to the idea that maybe the basic nature of our material physical world is not spatial. Well, here I even use the word physical world, right? Well, what does that mean exactly? So I actually want to leave that open. And by the way, one of the reasons why I'm excited to share a new classification is that the new classification, I think, can give us some clarity about more fundamental concepts that can then branch into all the different major theories. All right, so everything's fundamentally physical, and this sort of gets maybe clearer as we consider some particular versions of physicalism. One version of physicalism is called a limitivism. The idea here is that certain aspects of first-person consciousness, as you witness it within your own experience, maybe what it's like to be you smelling coffee, what it's like to experience a sensation, that these aspects aren't really there. They're not really characterizing anything that exists in reality. This view initially might strike you as, what do I want to say, not plausible or not commonsensical. But I think actually this view, the motivations for this view come from a lot of deep insights that I'm going to talk about in terms of a great challenge of understanding how consciousness, thoughts, feelings, intentions, as they appear in that first person experience, how they fit into the world, how we can make sense of them in terms of the material world. How do these things go together? There are different versions of limitivism based on which aspects are eliminated. Some theorists eliminate aboutness. So Alexander Rosenberg, for example, a philosopher of science, he's one of these guys who has argued that we don't find aboutness in the vocabulary of physics, and nor can we analyze aboutness in terms of that vocabulary. And he's made the argument that, strictly speaking, aboutness doesn't characterize anything. So we can actually give another theory that can maybe explain our instinct to think that aboutness characterizes things, characterizes thoughts. That's just one example. Others have eliminated what's called phenomenal consciousness, or the sort of what it's like to have certain experiences, a kind of sort of intrinsic qualitative aspect of consciousness. And others have eliminated other aspects of consciousness. A sort of a full limitivism would just say there's nothing that's, there's no experiences. There's no experience of a thought. There's no experience of an intention or an emotion. So that's called a limitivism, okay? And a flagship problem here, or challenge, would be your power to witness states of consciousness via introspection. You can think of introspection as a kind of inner awareness. So if you have this inner awareness of feeling curious, then that inner awareness is revealing some first-person aspects of consciousness as they are. Okay? And so this poses a kind of a challenge for the limitivists, because if the introspection is actually revealing reality as it is, then it seems to be revealing first-person states of consciousness, including the aboutness of thoughts, including experiential intentions, including the feeling of love. Now, let me just emphasize and underline this emphasis that the limitivists who work in the field, they're very aware of this. It's not like they're unaware that introspection poses a kind of, let's say, challenge or opportunity for challenging this view. And this is precisely why limitivists pay a lot of attention to what introspection is, how reliable it is, whether it's revealing reality as it is, or whether instead actually it's revealing things not as they are, but instead creating what we might call a kind of illusion. So illusionism is a form of limitivism that seeks to, in a sense, diagnose the problem with our tendency to think that there are these particular aspects of consciousness, whichever ones are on the table that somebody's proposing. So one common form of illusionism discussed today is saying that phenomenal consciousness, what it's like to experience something, is a kind of introspective illusion. There's a kind of illusion to what you're actually experiencing. If you have the feeling of loving somebody, that feeling is not really, your sense that that's real is not accurate. It's misleading you in some way. Okay. Now you might say, well, what about the illusion? Isn't the illusion itself, isn't there something that it's like to have an illusion? Isn't that part of consciousness? Right? Now the illusionists, they're well aware of this, and there's a kind of meta-analysis here where even your experience of the illusion is not sort of as it seems from first-person introspective awareness. That first-person introspective awareness is, in a way, giving you a way of accessing something else, let's say brain states, that are represented in ways that are not strictly real. Okay, now, see, I want to keep going. I want to keep talking about illusionism. I want to get into more details. Many of you watching this might have questions, thoughts, objections, ideas, and I just want to acknowledge all of that. There's just so much more to talk about here, but I want you just to see that there is a version of physicalism that eliminates certain aspects of consciousness, and then that's a way of saying that everything's fundamentally physical, and these aspects of consciousness, which you might think wouldn't be physical or fundamentally physical, are just not even there. So that would be a way of kind of solving a certain question or problem about how consciousness could arise out of fundamental physics. It's to actually, in a way, shave away the thing that's thought to arise. It doesn't arise. There aren't these first-person states of consciousness. Okay, so obviously there's more we could talk about there and think about, but that's one of the views, and I would say this is kind of the flagship challenge. I'm not saying this is the only challenge, but this is one that many limitivists, they talk about this. They're well aware of that challenge, and those who would argue against limitivism, the project there would be to engage with the limitivists' analysis of introspection. That's something that I work to do in my recent work in my book on consciousness. I take some time to talk about introspection. Okay, here's another theory. It's called reductive physicalism. This might be a more sort of common theory out there in the streets. People usually aren't thinking about eliminating their thinking and feeling and their thoughts as they experience them in first-person experience, but rather analyzing them in terms of, or reducing them to, underlying physical brain states. Now, just think again about those three questions that I mentioned earlier. The distinction between the question, what is the consciousness? Okay? And then what makes the consciousness? Sometimes, and I'm not saying always, sometimes I get the impression that some people are tempted to go from premise one, which says it looks like physical brain states are generating mental states, to this reductive conclusion that therefore mental states just are the same, that therefore the mental states just are the same thing as physical brain states. And we have to be careful here. We might appeal to simplicity here if we can make a reduction and there's fewer items. But if we're thinking in terms of the simplicity of a theory, how many parts and parameters are in our theory, there's actually a kind of symmetry that many people look past, and I myself looked past this until I thought more about theory comparison and how simplicity works in terms of comparing different theories. And what I realized is that the theory that physical brain states are the same thing as mental states, that theory has a kind of complexity that's the same as the theory that mental states are not the same as physical brain states. It's kind of like if you say, here's a theory about the sun and the moon. One theory is that the sun is the moon, viewed from a different perspective. Another theory is that the sun is not the moon. Okay? not even viewed from a different perspective. They're distinct things. Both those theories are sort of similar in the number of assumptions that they make. Even if the sun equals the moon theory in the end implies fewer numbers of things, the actual number of parameters or assumptions in the theory or premises in the theory are the same if you say the sun is the moon, if you say the sun is not the moon. So we want to, I think, be careful about our appeal to simplicity. But at the same time, I want to just acknowledge that there are some arguments for reduction that spring out of what I would say are flagship problems for other theories that I'm going to mention in a moment. But according to reduction, the mental states are the physical states, and that's not the same as saying that mental states generate the physical states. Those are importantly different ideas. So we have the version of reductive physicalism called type identity, which says that mental states of a certain type are physical states of a certain type. So the feeling of pain, that type of pain, that specific type of pain, let's say, is identical with a specific type of neurological activity, like a C fiber firing or whatever. A flagship challenge that I see many theorists talk about in their journey, maybe away from type identity, is called multiple realizability. Now, I actually don't think this challenge is the strongest challenge against type identity, but I think this is maybe it's been the most persuasive in some way, which you might say if it's the most persuasive, then it should be the most challenging. But I actually think there are stronger challenges to this view that could be more persuasive, but maybe they're just less known or it takes a certain kind of analysis to get to those. But this is one that I read a lot about in the kind of the story of a shift away from type identity by physicalists. Okay, and the story is that there are many different ways of realizing or instantiating the same type of experience. So if I have the experience of feeling pain, I don't need carbon atoms, that particular type of atom, carbon, to contribute to the realization of that pain. If you swapped all my carbon atoms one by one, replace them with silicon atoms, and as long as they function the same way, I could still have that same feeling of pain. The idea is that there's both maybe empirical evidence of multiple realizability, multiple ways of having the same type of experience with different physical states, as well as a kind of logical analysis that would say that as long as this is even logically possible, even if it's logically possible that you could have pain with different types of brain states, then that's enough to show a distinction between the pain type and the physical type. So that's a challenge to consider. And again, for all these challenges, I'm not saying that the theorists who work on this aren't aware of these challenges. They absolutely are. This is just one of the challenges that invites that inquiry to think more about this. Many philosophers today, and maybe this would be a kind of majority, who are physicalists, would go in for a kind of functionalist theory of consciousness. The functionalist theories emphasize functional relationships between states. So to illustrate a kind of functional relationship, imagine a doorstop. To be a doorstop is a function from inputs to outputs. So if the input would be you try to close the door, and then the doorstop creates the output of the door doesn't close. And that's like what it is to be a doorstop, is that it's able to function in that way of stopping the door if it's trying to close. In the same way, some have said that it's not that carbon atoms specifically have to realize consciousness. It's functional relationships between the states, whether they're carbon, silicon, computer chips. Once you get a certain kind of relationship between them, then that is going to be what, if it's reductive functionalism, what the state of consciousness is. Okay, not what generates the consciousness, not what makes it, not even what has it, but what it is. The feeling of love is a functional relationship between certain input states and certain output states. A flagship challenge would be, I would say, to use a kind of technical term, and I don't like to use this term actually in my own work because it just invites a lot of questions about how to define this exactly, but it's the term qualia, and the idea is that qualia is the plural of quale, and a quale is a qualitative aspect of consciousness that is described sometimes by the phrase what it's like, sort of the what it's likeness of conscious experience. the qualitative aspect of drinking coffee, what it feels like from the first person perspective, to be having a certain smell or experiencing a certain song in your mind. The thought is that if you pay attention to those, if you can use introspection and pay attention to those consciously, you sort of witness that there's something else besides mere function between input and output states that you're not consciously aware of in your brain. There's something else, there's something qualitative in the experience that seems to go beyond the mere function. So people debate that, and like I say, the functionalists are certainly well aware of that. That's why this term gets a lot of scrutiny, how to think about it. And when I say this is the flagship challenge, I'm not even saying I think this is the strongest challenge against functionalism. I actually offer a different challenge in my work based on what I call direct comparison. I believe that there's a way in which beings can consciously compare different states, and they can discern differences if there are differences. And that this can actually help us get a clearer insight for testing some of these theories. But my goal here is just to give you the lay of the land. It's kind of like a description of what I see philosophers kind of behind the scenes at the conferences, in the journals, what comes up a lot. Sort of how to think about kind of what are the main sort of issues that come up for the main theories. So I would say qualia, the problem of qualia, comes up with respect to functionalism. So we have arguments that try to draw this out. The famous or infamous, depending on how you think about it, knowledge argument, Chinese room argument, Chinese nation argument. These are arguments from John Searle about how things could function as if they're conscious, as if they think and know things, but they don't have that qualitative aspect of really understanding or experiencing consciousness. I have some contributions from what I call a counting argument that in the end you could think of these as drawing out an aspect of consciousness that you can witness from within. All right, so we looked at reductive theories of consciousness, and many physicalists who come into these fields, they will make arguments against these reductive theories. And I really want to underline what I just said, that it's many physicalists in these fields are arguing against these reductive theories. I think sometimes in more popular discussions, I get the impression, maybe from Twitter or Facebook, that there's kind of like two sides. There's the physicalists and then the dualists. We're going to talk about dualists in a moment. And that the people who are arguing against these physicalist theories that I just talked about, these reductive theories, are dualists who are not physicalists at all. This is not what I see as being, how do I want to say this? Because of course I do see dualists making arguments against reductive physicalists, but my impression is that kind of a dominant view in the field of the philosophy of mind is a kind of physicalistic view. And in fact, I myself have a view that I think can be worked out in a kind of broad physicalistic language. I'll talk about that at the end. But because there's a kind of broad physicalistic view among philosophers of mind, what I actually see is that it's physicalist philosophers who are creating what I would think of as the strongest and most interesting kind of objections against reductive physicalism. And this leads to a kind of non-reductive physicalism. So this is the view that mental states, they're not the same thing as physical states, but they're based in or realized by physical states. So this is how physical states can still be fundamental. The first things that exist are physical particles or fields or whatever they are. These are physical through and through, and they provide a ground basis for other interesting states to exist. And these other interesting states include states of love, states of curiosity, states of wondering how we all got here, states of wondering what is the nature of physical states. Think about that. Physical states ground and give rise to states that wonder about those very physical states, the wondering. I think that already is just very interesting and special. It's special that there's even a feeling of specialness. All of this arises out of the physical. Okay, so how does this happen? Well, one theory is called epiphenomenalism, What this theory says is the mental states are kind of like foam on an ocean wave. The foam represents states of consciousness, and the ocean underneath, or the wave underneath, represents the physical basis for those states of consciousness. It's the physics that's causing and generating the conscious experience, the psychology. And the psychology doesn't make a difference to the physics. Many philosophers have made arguments for this. I've been seeing even some scientists make arguments for this. Sean Carroll has a kind of argument for this, depending on kind of how I analyze what he means by mental states. But one way of interpreting him is he's saying that mental states characterized non-reductively, okay, if there were such states that are not reductive. I think he might favor kind of reductive physicalism. But if there are such states that are not reductive, then they would not have effects on physical states. And I'll say more about why that is in a moment when I look at a different theory that kind of motivates opposition to this theory. Or actually motivates this theory, which is a problem of seeing how the mental could make a physical difference if everything's already determined fundamentally by the physics. If the physics pull the strings, then there's a way in which the physics determine everything else, and so there's no room for the mental to determine anything of its own. So there's an argument here for epiphenomenalism. Frank Jackson, by the way, who's known for his knowledge argument for a kind of dualism, was earlier in his career an epiphenomenalist. So he thought that mental states are not the same as physical states. He argued for this based on his knowledge argument. But then he also thought that the physical states are the fundamental states. And he still thinks that. And these fundamental states, therefore, do all the acting, all the effect. They make all the effects. And so the mental states don't have effects of their own. So they're epiphenomenal. Now, Jackson ended up changing his mind on this later in his career, where he became more convinced of mental causation, which is, let's say, the flagship challenge, is evidence of real mental causation. That your intentions can actually make a difference to what you do and what you think. Like you can trace a sequence in your own mind of reasoning, where one step in the reasoning makes a difference to the next step in your own reasoning. Or you can form an intention to raise your finger, and that intention is actually relevant. I have this quote here by Jerry Fodder, who's kind of dramatic about his thoughts about mental causation. He says, "If it isn't literally true that my wanting is causally responsible for my reaching, and my itching is causally responsible for my scratching," right? There's something about that itchy feeling that motivates and inspires the motion of matter to lead to the scratching. And my believing is causally responsible for my saying. If none of that is literally true, then practically everything I believe about anything is false, and it's the end of the world. Okay, so that's the kind of dramatic point there. Now, you might say, well, that's fair enough. I mean, maybe things that we believe about the world, it's part of our common folk ontology, is mistaken. And maybe science needs to sort of update what we think we believe. And so once we understand that the physics pulls the strings, explains the effects, and then that would causally exclude the mind from having its own effects, well, then we can make this conclusion that our mental states don't actually cause material states. It's kind of an illusion of mental causation. You can sort of think of this as skating past the illusionist, the limitivist illusionist idea that mental states themselves are an illusion. No, they're real. You really do have a first-person sense or desire. They're all there. They're real, or at least some of them, let's say. But they don't really make a difference to the physical world. You are, in a sense, a puppet of microphysics. And the microphysics is not itself mental, and so everything is a puppet of the mindless. Unless you think the microphysics is mental. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I hope you can appreciate how epiphenomenalism is one version of non-reductive physicalism, and then that faces the flagship challenge of the evidence for mental causation. A second view, a version of physicalism that is probably familiar to you, I see this a lot in the popular sphere. Sometimes what I see is there's kind of a mix of the reduction and the elimination, as well as the emergence. But the emergence comes in when we do not reduce. Let me clarify. There are two different kinds of emergence. There's what's called strong emergence and weak emergence. In my book, I actually talk about a third kind, which I call incongruent emergence, where it's actually not a possible emergence, and that you could see this by the nature of the items in question. So maybe leaves can emerge from numbers. The nature of a number is not congruent with the nature of leaves. That would be incongruent emergence. But there's another kind of emergence called strong emergence, where it's left open whether it's possible for the emergence to happen. But the idea is the reason why it's called strong emergence is because there's no way to sort of see through deduction or through reasoning that the items in question would emerge from the base materials. So for example, if you have mental states that aren't physical states, according to non-reductive materialism, the mental states aren't themselves physical, they're based in the physical, but they're not themselves physical states. They're experiential states that you experience through first-person awareness. If those mental states aren't physical states, then their emergence, according to this view, is novel. And this is so important. I see so much talking past each other sometimes, especially in popular conversations, where people will sometimes say, well, we can explain the mental states in terms of the physical states, right? But that term explains has different meanings. And in this context, when people are talking about emergence, the meaning here has to do with a logical analysis where you can explain by deduction that if you organize these states in this way, then you're going to have this feeling of love. And when the theorists are saying we can't explain the feeling of love from the organization of these particles, they're saying that you can't deduce just by knowing the positions and organizations of those spatial aspects of those particles, the physical aspects, the first-person experiential aspect of love. That's what's being said there. And then the emergence is basically just saying, hey, you know what? We don't see how this explains that in this sense of logical deduction. We don't see that. But we have empirical scientific evidence that there is this emergence. It actually does happen. So there's evidence that mental stuff emerges out of micro-physical stuff, right? So that would be kind of emergentist view. And I find that this view is interesting because it seems like the philosophers of mind who think about this, they analyze its problems. I want to give you a kind of flagship challenge for this. A lot of them move towards some of these other views, the reduction or epiphenomenalism or even a limitivism, because of some of these challenges. But in the popular sphere, I see that this sort of comes up a lot, and one might even think, well, of course, this is sort of the best version of physicalism. Here's a reason why many physicalists reject this view. And again, this isn't coming from dualists now. This is coming from physicalists. Many of them would make an argument from causal exclusion. Papineau makes an argument from causal exclusion of the mental from the microphysical based on an idea called causal closure. According to causal closure, the physical domain is causally closed in the sense that if there's some kind of physical effect, okay, there's going to be some kind of physical cause of that physical effect. And in general, if there's any kind of effect, even if it's not physical, like a mental state, if you're a non-reductive physicalist, there's going to be a physical cause of that. But then the problem here, Jaegwon Kim is kind of famous for drawing out this causal exclusion problem, is that if we actually are non-reductive physicalists, and we say mental states are not the same as physical states, but are based in physical states, then the physical domain, which is more fundamental, threatens to causally exclude the possibility of mental states making a difference to the physical world. Jaegwon Kim, in his book, Physicalism or Something Near Enough, he actually follows this argument to a very interesting conclusion. He follows the argument for thinking that, in fact, we have to reduce the causes, the mental states that make the causes. But Kim also, this is the reason why he calls it physicalism or something near enough, he's actually persuaded by, I'm going to just go back here so you can see this, he's persuaded by the problem of qualia. He thinks that there are qualitative aspects of consciousness that aren't reducible to microphysical states. or even macrophysical states. So he challenges the functionalism through this kind of qualitative aspect of consciousness. This is Jaegwon Kim in Physicalism or Something Near Enough. But he's also plagued by his own causal exclusion problem with this emergent view that would say, hey, let's be non-reductive, so mental states are not themselves physical. But then how do you find room for the mental to cause things? And what his solution is to suggest that there are two kinds of mental states. There's qualitative mental states, those don't reduce, and those don't have causal impact. And then there's other mental states that do have causal impact, and they do reduce. So that's the kind of solution that he gives. Jerry Fodder, he's actually responding to the kind of solution that Kim gives. He's saying it's the actual qualitative aspects, the itching, that's causally connected to and responsible for these changes in motion. These aren't just epiphenomenal byproducts. All right, so I hope you can appreciate that physicalists are raising challenges for other physicalists. In every view, in the reductive and in the non-reductive terrain of views, there are physicalists arguing against those views on behalf of other views. And this is great. This is kind of maybe what we would expect in a healthy inquiry. We're trying to make some progress. And again, I sort of feel this pull to go into more and more detail, but I got to just keep going so you can get that big picture. I think I'm already giving you more of a vision than maybe you would normally see initially, and I hope that's the case. If all this is already familiar to you, congratulate yourself, because not a lot of people are aware even of these distinctions here. And so I think getting at this level just by itself is going to empower clarity. All right, you guys know about panpsychism. This is all the rage these days, famous and infamous. But this is the idea that mentality is ubiquitous, fundamental in nature, and by nature I mean something like the natural or physical world. Now, I'm going to be a little bit careful here, because you could be a physicalist panpsychist and you could be a non-physicalist panpsychist. Here I'm just thinking of physicalist theories, and I'm including panpsychism in here as a non-reductive physicalist theory because it's recognizing that mental states are based in or realized by physical states. Okay, but here's the idea. If the basic physical states are themselves mental, then we can avoid the causal exclusion problem using another idea. We avoid it by saying that the mental is real. It is as it seems from first-person experience. But its depth in our physical natural world is all the way to the bottom. It's one of the ground level aspects. So here we could say maybe some mental states are based on physical states, are based ultimately on a ground level that's both physical and mental at the same time. That's sort of the idea here if you're a panpsychist physicalist. These physical states are themselves at the base going to include mental states. And this then can restore mental causation. You can think of it like this. When you're forming an intention to love somebody, and that intention results in brain activity, resulting in your hands going to picking up a pen and writing out a letter, and you're going to express something to this person about how you appreciate them, how you realize the value of what they're doing, how maybe you missed some things before that now you I'm going, you know what I'm saying. You write this letter. So now how does this letter emerge out of that intention? Well, according to the panpsychist, here's an option. The intention makes a difference at the fundamental level of nature and has ripple effects into your brain and out into your behavior. So this is one of the options. All right, what's a flagship challenge for the panpsychist? Well, here it is. Panpsychists know this. There's this problem called the combination problem, which is a problem of seeing how you can take little bits of conscious things and combine them to form a being that's unified in its conscious experience. This combination problem itself divides into different problems. One way that I like to divide this is into two problems. One is, how do you get little things into an organized single field of awareness? So if I'm having a thought in one part of my physical brain, and I'm having a feeling in another part of my physical brain. How do these things come together into a single conscious experience so I, for my first person experience, can say, hey, I'm feeling X and thinking Y. It's not just like there's one unified experience that's having the thinking, another unified experience that's having the feeling. They're together in a single experience. So that's one problem of combination. Another is the problem of combining things to form the being. Not just the experience of the being, but the being that has the experience, the me. Lots of different molecules, many different clouds of atoms that overlap each other in my brain. Which of those is me? And how do those atoms come together to form me? A reason why this is a problem or challenge, let's say, for the panpsychist, by the way, it's sometimes called the binding problem. It's the same thing, combination, binding problem, is that a panpsychist, at least one version of panpsychism, has it that the basic elements of reality, okay, are diverse fields, particles, and they organize kind of from the ground up to produce unified conscious beings. So there's a question of, well, how does that work, even in principle? How does that happen? This is kind of like a hard problem, not of consciousness, but of combination. So a hard problem of consciousness is sort of seeing how you could explain consciousness out of unconscious bits, how organizing unconscious bits could explain consciousness, especially on a non-reductive view of consciousness. Similarly, we have a problem of seeing how we could sort of explain the unified conscious beings out of even conscious bits. How do conscious bits come together to have unified conscious beings? Philip Goff is an interesting philosopher who's done a lot of great work on this. And he has a view, he calls it cosmo-panpsychism, which helps address this problem by seeing how maybe there's a way in which we don't start with lots of little micro things, but there's a kind of whole of reality. This leads to a kind of decombination problem, how you get the kind of whole of the physical universe to sort of decombine to form different conscious beings. But there are some maybe different problems associated with decombination than with combination, as this opens up all sorts of interesting questions along the lines of sort of how these parts and wholes go together. Remember I mentioned mereology earlier? Here it comes back to us. Lesniewski came up with some axioms of mereology and then some theorems. And there's some questions about, well, which axioms do we accept? Which axioms apply to conscious beings? But this is all very, very relevant for a full analysis of the nature of consciousness and how consciousness came to be. And conscious beings came to be. And the unification came to be. All right, so I hope it's helpful to see. Here's a range of options under the physicalist tent. These aren't, of course, all of the options, but I would say these are the main players today and the kind of the main challenges. Again, not the only challenges, but some of the main ones that people are thinking about. All right, now we go to dualism. So what is dualism? Well, dualism is the idea that mind and body aren't the same. And one version of dualism is called property dualism, which focuses on properties. It says that mental properties are not themselves the same as physical properties, okay, or brain properties. Now, I want to be a little careful here. I had a correspondence with Daniel Dennett. This was years ago. I was in graduate school, and we were in an email conversation about one of my contributions to the field on the topic of property dualism. And he made the point, which I thought was a great point in his email to me, that the reduction of the mental to the physical need not be purely within the brain. He made a point about the physical environment itself being part of the reductive base for physical properties if there's a reduction there. And I think that's a good point. So property dualism, you can think of it generally as mental properties are physical properties. Oh yeah, I didn't mention this earlier when I was talking about physical. And it has to do with a range of definitions. I've noticed some people have defined physical as just anything real. And others have defined physical as anything that can interact with anything. I've seen these definitions both from students as well as from friends on social media. And this helps me to just appreciate the semantic range of the word. My sense is, more than my sense, I think I can claim to have knowledge of this, that the philosophers who are working in this field, they're thinking of physical in a more narrow way than just anything real or even anything that can interact, because it's an open philosophical question, a substantial question, whether everything real is physical, and even whether everything real that can interact is physical. But if we narrow the scope a little bit, so it's what physicists can study, or to things that are positioned in space, some kind of spatial aspect or spatial entailing aspect, or something that is just like whatever it is, the stuff that gives rise to spatial aspects, just call that physical. If we think about it that way, then I think we can appreciate the property dualism is saying that the first person experiential properties, or what it's like to feel or to intend and to love, those aren't reducible to spatial relations. They're not reducible to positions in space or functions of positions in space. So this would be a property dualist position. And many philosophers who are not reductive physicalists, who are physicalists, but not, I said that right, are not reductive physicalists, they would then turn toward a kind of property dualism. So this is included under the non-reductive physicalism, but you don't actually have to be a physicalist to be a property dualist. This is going to depend even on how you define physical, which is just kind of a big question of how you want to define that. But I would say in Occam's razor for this view, I was thinking a bit about what would be the flagship problem or challenge that I'm seeing. And I thought, well, let me just say Occam's razor to start, that Occam's razor invites us to simplify our theory. So if we can explain everything about the brain without positing in addition to physical brain properties, then the onus is on the one who's going to posit these extra spooky things that aren't realized, they're not themselves brain properties. Another kind of angle on this is that hard problem of consciousness. If we can't see how to explain through a kind of analysis or deduction, the emergence of these mental properties, especially also if it gives rise to that causal exclusion problem, then it would be sort of simpler to have a theory that just does without non-physical mental properties. All right, so that would be kind of a flagship problem there. Another form of dualism that you may be familiar with is substance dualism. Here again, I was thinking, how do I phrase this in a way that is simple and intuitive, but that captures sort of a wide range of options that go under substance dualism. This may not be a perfect definition, but I think this will give you a good flavor of how philosophers are thinking about this, people working in the field, is that conscious beings like you and I, human beings, we are a distinct kind of substance or being from physical things like brains. This is so tricky because if you look up the word substance in Google, many of those definitions, almost all of them, include the word physical in the definition of substance. And this helps me to appreciate a problem, I think, that we have who are working in the field of philosophy of mind to translate what we mean. If we're going to say that there are non-physical substances, and if the definition of substance in many people's mind includes being physical, then no wonder people are going to say substance dualism is a contradiction in terms, because it implies that there is a kind of substance, a kind of physical substance that's not even physical, which is of course a contradiction. But that's not what substance dualists mean. They do not mean that by substance something physical. Instead, they're thinking about this more in an Aristotelian way, that there's something that has states or properties. Like, water has a state of being frozen. Okay? A being has a state of thinking something. And then the question is, what's the nature of the thing that has those properties? One challenge here in even defining these terms is how you even think about what it means to say what kind of a thing it is without talking about its properties. I remember at Notre Dame having long conversations with philosophers, graduate students, about how we could actually distinguish property dualism from substance dualism if having non-physical properties implies the kind of thing that it is, namely non-physical. Because you don't want to say it's both non-physical and physical. That's again a contradiction. All right, so there are open questions about how to define these things. And for me, I've actually found it helpful to use more other concepts. That's why I'm going to give you a classification at the end that's maybe a little bit different, that overlaps with this, but doesn't sort of treat this as sort of the way of dividing the landscape of dualism. So I really do think these distinctions, maybe it's a good start, but sometimes I think it leads to more confusion. Okay, well, maybe there's ways that we can clarify this. In fact, I'm sure there certainly are ways that we can try to clarify this, but I'm going to leave it here. And I want to just say that under substance dualism, there are different examples. I like to kind of divide all the examples of substance dualism into two. There's what's called compound dualism, which says that you are a compound of different kinds of things, body and soul. So Cartesian dualism, there's a version of that would be a compound dualism. So Descartes could say that you are a combination of body and soul. These are different kinds of things. Hylomorphism sometimes is contrasted with Cartesian dualism, but still the idea is that there's a combination of form and matter. And you are a kind of a third thing. You're the combination of the form and matter. Richard Swinburne is kind of famous for being a compound dualist. One sort of challenge that comes up is what happens if you're a compound dualist and you think that you could survive the destruction of your body. So your body goes away and your soul lives on. Well, now which thing are you? Are you your soul? Well, you couldn't be your soul because the soul was a mere part of you. So the soul actually has a different history. The soul was a mere part of you. You were never a mere part of you. That actually violates one of those axioms in mereology, that something can be wholly a proper part of itself, or merely a part of itself. That you might think is impossible. And so there's a certain kind of challenge here, and Swinburne's aware of this, and he's got ways of talking about that, responding to that. But there's a kind of that question, which thing are you? If you're not your soul, you're the combination. What happens if you lose your body? Then what, is it that you and the soul are not maybe located, you don't even have a spatial position, but is your soul your one proper part? See, if that's true, that violates an axiom called supplementation, I think, is the axiom that you can't have just one proper part because there's always the remainder. It would be your other proper part. But, maybe supplementation is not correct, So anyway, we could keep going into the analysis, but the point is the analysis is so important for clarifying our options, for empowering before we even begin to make arguments for one view over another, just to clarify what's at stake. Pure dualism, sometimes I've heard this called Platonic dualism, that you are a single substance, but there's another kind of substance, your body, which is different, and you aren't a combination of body and soul. You are just you. Maybe we could call that a soul, mental kind of thing, conscious kind of thing, and but you're not a combination with different parts. All right, the flagship problem, I would say, is very obvious. This is the problem that's always brought up in many different contexts, sometimes triumphantly and definitively with great certainty, sometimes as an invitation to provide responses. But here I like what John Searle says: no one has ever succeeded in giving an intelligible account of the relationship, the interaction between these two realms. How can a fundamentally first-person conscious realm connect with and interact with a fundamentally physical third-person realm, even in principle? How could they go together? Many things to say about this, many questions about what gives rise to the problem. Some people have said that it's a kind of a like causes like problem. You can't have unlike things cause unlike things. I don't really think that gets to the root of it. I think that actually deeper in, it's not about having different things causing different things. I think it has to do with more specifically certain natures being incongruent with other natures. And actually this problem has grown on me as I've looked more into this, how certain kinds of things could interact with other kinds of things. This leads to a problem, a question. Okay, it seemed like maybe there was one other thing I wanted to say about that, but if it comes back to me, I'll share that. Here, let me just again underline the fact that there are many different people thinking about this from different perspectives. And it's so valuable, I think, if before we start making arguments for and against, we can just get greater awareness and clarity about what the different kind of options even are. Some have said that we can solve interaction problem if the things are united in a deeper way through a kind of hylomorphic unity. I'm not so sure about that. I think my view on this is that this interaction problem kind of takes new forms. It maybe comes back in new language when we try to tighten up the unity. There's still questions remaining about how these different kinds of things can go together. I'm not saying there can't be good answers to these questions. There are certainly answers available. I think some of them are very interesting. But this is one of the major problems that people have brought up, both conceptually and also empirically, wondering how these things could go together. And so this challenges substance dualism. Again, it's not the only kind of challenge. There's also the Occam's razor concern, why posit this? One kind of motivation, of course, for the substance dualism would be the flagship problems with all the other views, right? Of course, every proponent of every view can kind of maybe see the flagship problems of the other views and use those as motivations for their own view. And then, of course, they recognize their own flagship problem, so then they try to offer a solution to that. So I hope you can appreciate how every view can kind of be motivated then by considering these deep problems. And everybody from every view has problems to think about. Okay, you guys, now, am I done with the classic classification? Have I talked about all the major options? There's an option missing. There's one left of the major options that are classically discussed. You guys know what it is? Can you anticipate what this is? Some of you know what this is. Some of you may not know. You might be wondering, which one's left out? This is one that, to be honest, in my graduate school classes, wasn't always listed among the options. It's a little bit kind of on the edges. And I think it's a very interesting view. When I share with you the view, you're gonna recognize it. It is, you know what it is, idealism. Now again, this is one of those terms that's hard to define in a way that's both simple, that also encompasses kind of the wide range of idealist views out there. Absolute idealism, transcendental idealism, objective idealism, different versions of idealism. But I thought this definition probably gets the spirit of it. Everything that exists is ultimately mental. Okay, what does that mean? Well, something like this. Everything is analyzable in terms of mental items in consciousness. Things like thoughts, intentions, spatial structures and visual images, or any contents of consciousness. Okay. And I was thinking here, well, do I need to say, or the conscious being itself? And I thought, oh, that's okay, because you could be an idealist and you could think a conscious being could itself be a content of its own consciousness. So I thought this is probably pretty good at getting the spirit of a wide range of idealist views. This characterization is a little bit more narrow than some characterizations that broaden the tent, so that it can include things that depend on the mind but aren't necessarily analyzable in terms of the mind. But I think the spirit of most idealist views, it's not just mere dependence, it includes a kind of analysis. But I'm going to come back to the dependence idea later when I give my new classification, because there can be room for idealists to kind of widen that tent, just as there's room for physicalists to widen their tent. You can be a physicalist idealist, by the way. This is not a mutually exclusive option. There are those who would say, I'm a physicalist and I'm an idealist. But again, it depends on how you're defining the terms. There's kind of a semantic range here. All right, you guys, what's the flagship problem? What's kind of the challenge for the idealists? This is actually kind of a little difficult for me, because even though I've been reading a lot more lately about idealism and critiques and kind of reading the literature on this, it seems like it's one of those views that's kind of out there, maybe in the wilderness, and it's not gotten the same kind of attention it then the standard divisions that we've looked at, the forms of dualism, and especially the different forms of physicalism. And so I don't know what the flagship problem would be. I'm not saying there aren't objections to it or there aren't problems being raised, but I would say probably the most common kind of instinct that I see out there is something like maybe just, okay, I've got a note here about brains I want to share, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I want to share with you the flagship problem. So the flagship problem that I have at the end of this slide here is just its lack of familiarity, a kind of incredulous stare. It sort of seems contrary to common sense. The stone objection. You kick the stone. That stone is not an image. Okay. Of course, if you ever had a dream where you kicked a stone in a dream and you felt the touch feeling, maybe even a little bit of a hurt feeling in a dream, you might notice that when you're awake and you kick a stone, you could have the same kind of feeling. Same feeling. And then, of course, there's the question, well, what's behind the feeling? Well, maybe something else that causes that feeling. But is the cause of that feeling itself something that's analyzable in terms of mentality? If mental states can cause other states, like in your dream, what's causing you to have the feeling in your dream of kicking a rock? Well, it's not a rock in your dream. But when you're awake, you say, well, there's a rock out there. Well, what is a rock? Could you analyze a rock in terms of states that cause a shared group of consciousness to have that experience? Well, this leads to this next piece I was going to share with you, which is kind of how you might think of brains. Because you might think, well, of course, idealism doesn't make sense because brains aren't analyzed in terms of mental items. Brains give rise to mental items. Brains produce the mental items. Well, here's an analysis of what a brain is from an idealistic perspective. You might think that a spatial brain, I'm using the term spatial, just to kind of pick out the idea that the brain is this configuration that appears to us in visual experience. All right. If I leave this out, then maybe a brain itself could be a kind of non-spatial form of consciousness. But here I want to just think of spatial brains. That's kind of how we ordinarily think about them, like spatial positions. This would be a mental representation in visual experience of what? A control system of algorithms that facilitate conscious experiences, certain conscious experiences. Sometimes people, I will see, skip past the distinction between forms of conscious experience and then the general category of being some conscious experience. It might be that what brains do is they facilitate through functions, okay? They're a kind of functionalist device, inputs and outputs that are themselves forms or states of conscious experience. So these forms of conscious experience then, they're not just random, they're systemized. And they're systemized in ways that help us get along in our environment, get along with each other. One of the best models for this that I've seen in the scientific literature is by a scientist named Paul Kysick, and he offers what he calls the control model of the brain. He's not coming at this from an idealist perspective at all, which in a way makes me maybe appreciate his work all the more. He's not using his work in support of idealism. He's got a non-idealistic vision of his view of the brain. But it doesn't really matter because his view of the brain, the control model of the brain, fits very well. It is consistent with idealism. The idea is that there's a system of algorithms that facilitate conscious experience, help us adapt to our environment. And then you might think that if we actually consciously look at those algorithms, our own consciousness generates a mental representation in terms of shapes that represent the algorithms for facilitating conscious experience. This is why if you change the brain, it's going to both change how it looks to you geometrically and spatially, as well as it's going to change your consciousness because it's going to change those algorithms for experience. All right, so this is just an idea. I'm not saying all idealists would endorse this. I'm just kind of trying to fill out the view a little bit so you can see how, from an idealistic view, mentality could be at the base of the analysis, even of the brain itself. Brains themselves are analyzed in terms of inputs and outputs of conscious states. So we've got the incredulous stare. Maybe that's our flagship problem for the idealist. Maybe there's another problem that would be better here, and maybe somebody watching this would like to suggest that. That would be great. But I think there's just a lot of innovative and new work to be done thinking about how mind could provide an analysis of everything else. All right, you guys, we just finished a bird's eye view of theories of consciousness. If you go into the field further, obviously you're going to find more distinctions under every one of those distinctions. But I hope it's helpful to sort of see how, from a big picture perspective, you got the physicalism and the reductive versus non-reductive, the dualism, property dualism, substance dualism. I just remembered what I was going to say earlier, talking about the property dualism. And it had to do with John Searle in his own classification of his own view. He's got an article where he says why I'm not a property dualist, and it has to do with his thinking about what it means for the properties to be physical. Whereas other philosophers on a different definition of physical have argued that John Searle is himself a property dualist, which is kind of interesting because he's saying he's not. Now you might say, well, surely Searle has a right to say, what his view is. Fair enough, but I think what's helpful is to realize that there's a definition of physical on which John Searle's not a property dualist. There's another definition of physical on which he is a property dualist. In a way, I'm kind of glad that I'm bringing this, that I forgot that, and I'm bringing this up here, because the challenge of defining the word physical is precisely what motivates me to think about this new classification, which will also include the idealist views as well. So the new classification, what I want to do here is I want to dig to the most kind of basic concepts that are animating the questions about the mind. What the mind is, what makes it, what has it. And I want to just suggest that we could analyze all the different theories as falling into two groups, two types. There's mind-first theories. These are theories that analyze things in reality, ultimately in terms of some kind of mentality. I'm going to say more about that. And then there are mindless first theories that start with mindless things and analyze everything in terms of that. So let me say a little bit more about the mindless first theories. We could describe this as mindless reality is more fundamental prior to mental reality. So you got particles or fields that are fundamentally mindless, and let's say these are the most fundamental actors of reality, or most fundamental pieces of reality. These are the building blocks, and then mind is generated out of there if there is mind. So now we can think about the three views. We've got limitivism, reductionism, and non-reduction views. The limitivism say there is no mental reality, or we could eliminate some mental reality like thoughts and feelings and not others, let's say. But if you take the full limitivist view, it's like there's nothing that's actually mental. There's just mindless stuff hitting mindless stuff. And the feeling that there's something mental is just an illusion. Okay. And of course, even the feeling that it's an illusion, there's not even that feeling really. There's just the mindless activities of saying that there's a feeling of an illusion, that there's mind. Are you guys with me here? Does this make sense? So this is the familiar limitivist view, but we can think of this as a version now of a mindless first view. This is going to leave open the option that you could be a physicalist, but not a mind first theorist, or a mindless first theorist. So it's going to allow the semantic range for physical to keep its wide range, but we can get a little more focused on how mind, because the theory of mind is about mind. This is why I want a classification that classifies all the different theories in terms of the concept that we're trying to investigate. Mind first versus mindless first. So we got the reductionist view that mental reality is analyzed in terms of more fundamental mindless reality. And the non-reductivist, the physicalist view is going to say that mental reality is grounded in or emerges from mindless reality. Okay. Now you can anticipate that just as there's these three mindless first views, each inviting different theories within and various problems and challenges, we've got the three mind first views. Mind first views just say mental reality is fundamental. Everything else comes from there. Now, you could try to mix and match these. Could you have it that it goes from mindless to mental to mindless to mental in a kind of infinite regress? Okay, so you could sort of think about that. But for purposes of thinking about mental reality, I don't want to think in terms of mind and then the mindless. I want to think about even just here and now. Like, what is the most fundamental nature of fundamental reality? What's the basic nature of reality? If there even is a basic nature of reality. Now, in the mind first view, mentality is sort of prior to mindless states. If you think about a mental image as itself not having its own conscious mind, then you could say the mental image is, in a sense, mindless because it doesn't have a mind. The mental image doesn't have a mind, but exists within a mind. So then the idea is that a mind is able to give rise to something that is itself mindless, unless you want to say it's mental because it exists in a mind, but doesn't have a mind, doesn't have its own mind. That's the idea. All right, so we got the three views here. A limitivist idealism, which says matter doesn't exist, or physical stuff, let's say, depending on whether you want to talk about matter or physical stuff, isn't really there. What's really there are your experiences. And when physicists are talking about their subject matter, physical matter, what they're actually talking about more fundamentally are relations of mental experiences. So you have certain mental experiences, then you'll have certain other mental experiences, and we have equations of physics that help us to predict the pattern of mental experiences that we have in response to our activities. That'd be kind of a limitivist idealism. Now, there's a kind of nice symmetry here, because in the same way that you might, how do I want to put this? Let me just shoot it straight. You might find this as initially sort of counterintuitive and absurd, and not just initially, like even after reflection, as many would say about the limitivist materialism that says that there is matter, but there's no mind. This is just the symmetry of that there is mind, but there's no matter. So you might think of those as sort of equally sort of hard to think about, but then in the same way that there are defenders of a limitivist today, through analyzing the hard problems, you might think about how maybe there could be similar defense of a limitivist idealism through symmetrical analysis. We've got reductive idealism. Matter is analyzable in terms of states of mind. We have non-reductive mentalism, on which matter is grounded in or emerges from a more fundamental reality, which is mental. Now, to give you maybe a card on the table, one of my cards on the table, let me just say that this view, non-reductive mentalism, has been one that I have found very intriguing and very helpful to think about in my own work. But I have been experiencing a kind of gestalt shift, where I have been seeing how it might be possible to analyze states of matter in terms of states of mind, such that this reductive idealism is a view that I am finding very intriguing. In fact, I would probably just go ahead and say that this is currently my working hypothesis. I don't want to overemphasize that, because the core conclusions that I arrive at are kind of consistent with any mind-first approach. And it's the mind-first approach that I think actually rolls away some of the toughest challenges. I'm not saying this doesn't have its own challenges to face, but a lot of those flagship problems can be reconfigured and I think just even roll away with a mind first. Some kind of mental reality is fundamental. And so I kind of like to leave open these options, but I've been very, very interested in this kind of reductive idealism lately. So just to kind of put that card on the table. And I hope that you can see how there's that symmetry between the mind first and mindless first views that I think can help organize all the different theories in a way that digs to a more fundamental concept that we're trying to investigate, which is the nature of the mind, nature of consciousness. So every one of these views then can invite that question. What is the consciousness? What is it? What makes it? And what has it? If you take a kind of non-reductive mentalism, where mind comes first, you could say that mind, mental reality, mental substance, makes contents of consciousness. It's like this. It's mental substance produces thoughts, feelings, intentions, and even visual imagery with spatial aspects. So you can have a spatial experience like in a dream or something like this. But it's not just that the mental substance makes the consciousness, it's that the mental substance itself has consciousness. It has within it intentions and thoughts. So the maker is the haver in this way. Then we don't have to multiply entities. We have the maker that is the haver. The maker of the consciousness also has the consciousness. That's kind of an interesting way to think about that. That would be consistent with a number of these different options here. That you could have the thing that makes the consciousness, that grounds the consciousness, also the thing that has the consciousness. All right, I want to just close this out with a few statements about where I think the work in consciousness is going, the future of the study of the mind. What I have noticed something so fascinating. This is one of those things where when I'm taking that walk around the block and I'm holding my newborn and I'm thinking about the clouds of controversy, I can get so excited about developments behind the scenes of those clouds that a lot of people do not seem to be aware of. But the excitement is that this is breaking out. People are starting to see this more. And this is the trend that I am seeing. I am seeing that as scientists and philosophers go into this road that investigates the problems of the mind, of thoughts, of feelings, intentions, the unification of consciousness, even our ability to persist from moment to moment while having a thought. We didn't talk about theories of persistence here, but there's a whole set of problems around theories of persistence. Of course, the hard problem of consciousness, many people are familiar with that. How do you explain consciousness out of microphysical states? There are just many different problems of identity, of parts and wholes. How does this all go together? And this is my observation. As people go into this road, they tend to either increase their impression about the nature of mind and the fundamentality of mind. Peter Unger, for example, earlier in his career, he was thinking about how does mind fit into the physical world? And through thinking about that, later in his career, he makes arguments against physicalist views, thinking that mind is deeper in. David Chalmers, same thing. He's one of the most famous philosophers today who coined that term hard problem of consciousness, making an argument that consciousness or proto-consciousness, some sort of element of consciousness, is deeper in, more fundamental into our world. There's more mind. Or the path is to say there's less mind, it's less real, it's less substantial. Maybe it's epiphenomenal. When you form an intention, it doesn't actually make a difference. Because in order to make a difference, it would have to be deeper in. Otherwise, it's causally excluded. It has to be deeper in. You'd have to have more mind. But if it's not deeper in, if the basic nature is microphysics, mindless microphysics, then the tendency is to have less mind in your theory. It's epiphenomenal, or you eliminate it. It's not even real. It's not actually there. That would be a general trend that I see from philosophers who go into this. I'm not saying everybody takes that path, but that would be a general trend that I see. And it comes from grappling with the problem of fitting consciousness into our theory of reality. So what I want to just offer you, just in conclusion and closing, is I want to offer you a prediction. This is my prediction about how I think the clarity in the landscape of different theories from many different people coming together to offer their piece without competition, but with collaboration. Maybe some competition can help stir some new pieces into some new discoveries. But if we can all kind of bring our pieces together, what my prediction is that the trend to minimize or to maximize, to either go to removing consciousness or to seeing it as more fundamental, deeper in, is actually going to continue to happen until a consensus of scientists completes a paradigm shift that is currently happening. I say it's currently happening because I've been seeing many different scientists. I've been reading different neuroscientists, reading their books, reading their technical articles, talking about these things, and it looks like something new is happening. There's a paradigm shift. I mention scientists. I don't mention philosophers of mind, even though I am a philosopher and I appreciate philosophers. I appreciate the work that we do. I think philosophers and scientists, we need to work together more closely. I think we need to be able to kind of not fight for our turfs, but listen to each other, learn from each other, kind of pay attention to the different styles, see if we can incorporate those. I say scientists because I think people look to the scientists. Scientists have a kind of authority in our culture. And I think that as this paradigm shift comes into a completion, it's actually going to lead to a change in this trend. So right now the trend is to minimize or to maximize. Some are kind of maybe holding on to certain views. That's fine. That's valuable. But I really do think that what's going to happen is that the paradigm shift, as it comes into a completion, it's not going to be, of course, 100% complete, but it's going to include a greater role for mind in our theories of matter. I think this is the future. I think this is where we're going to see breakthroughs and progress happening. And even if we can just sort of think about this as a hypothesis, instead of as a battle for one view over another, or like I won because this view is right and that view is not right. If we can all kind of get a little bit curious and just think, well, let's think about how a certain aspect of mind could play a role in understanding effects in our brain. We already have this going on. We already have a lot of interesting science on positive psychology, for example, or neuroplasticity, on mental effects in our brains that seem to be correlated with intentions and certain states of consciousness. We also have interesting work in physics talking about the role of information and even explaining and making sense of space-time itself emerging from prior states. Carlo Rovelli is one person that I've read on this. There are others, but he's somebody who talks about the informational states being themselves explanatorily prior to the spatial qualities out there. If we can sort of think about, well, how might mind play a role in these informational states? Is there a way of thinking about mind, broadly speaking, so we can get a deeper understanding of our physics? And again, to do this in a spirit of exploration. I really do think that this is going to result in a greater collective understanding in our time. I think for many years we've been experimenting and exploring the idea that mind is entirely a byproduct of mindless states that are more fundamental. I think that exploration has been so valuable because it's through that very exploration that you have the physicalist philosophers uncovering these flagship problems and analysis with increasing detail. And I think understanding those problems helps us to appreciate how mind can play a role in the motions and movements of matter. There's a lot of interesting work to be done. I think we need more people from more perspectives bringing more data to the table for us to make progress together. So I want to just conclude by saying, you guys, thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate all of you. And as you can see on the screen, we have some shapes that represent an underlying mental state of appreciation for you. So thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful for you. And I just want to really wish you the best as you think about some of these big questions in relation to how we got here, what we are, what is our nature, and how we fit into